Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. This is a very special edition of The Journey Home because we're going to have a very special guest. Many of you have seen the series here on EWTN hosted by Dale Ahlquist entitled GK Chesterton, the Apostle of Common Sense. That series has brought to life the wit and wisdom of the great Catholic author GK Chesterton. Well, speaking of bringing this writer to life, we thought it would be interesting to interview G.K. Chesterton himself right here on The Journey Home. Now, you might be wondering how that's possible since Chesterton was born in 1874 and went to be with the Lord in 1936. Well, with God and with a little bit of EWTN drama, all things are possible. We're going to have G.K. Chesterton as our guest tonight via satellite. The only problem is he hasn't arrived yet. He was supposed to have arrived quite some time ago, but apparently he has experienced some delay. In the meantime, I'll tell you a little bit about G.K. Chesterton, Gilbert Keith Chesterton. He was a prolific writer, author of 100 books, internationally known as a journalist, speaker, debater, radio broadcaster, and Roman Catholic convert. A convert who played an important role in the conversion of many others. It's an amazing story, and we're going to oh, wait a minute. Here he comes now, Mr. G.K. Chesterton. Welcome to The Journey Home.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. I'm terribly sorry I'm late. I missed my train. Seems the only way I ever catch my train is if I catch the train after that. But I am delighted to be here.
Well, there's no need to apologize, of course.
Many people consider me to be an apologist.
Okay, but honestly, we're so pleased that you could be with us. I was beginning to tell our viewers your story, but of course, I would much rather you tell it yourself. And if you don't mind, Mr. Chesterton, I would like you to begin at the beginning.
Beginnings are good places to begin, but also good places to end. After all, this is the journey home. And home is the place where one begins, but home is also the place where one hopes to end.
Well, then tell us about your childhood.
Well, I'm afraid that is a long story, because you see, I believe in prolonging childhood. Goodness knows that I have tried to prolong my own childhood, at least until now. I have never really left off playing. In fact, I wish there were more time to play. Just the other day, I was balancing a ball on the top of my... Oh, dear, my hat, I'm sorry. Dear. Terribly sorry. I can say there was something about my childhood, my youngest years, that can only be described as a white light, the very opposite of a dream. The world had a greater reality, greater solidity than any time in my adult years. It was not merely a material reality, you see, but a spiritual reality as well, a complete reality. And part of this reality, this real world, was the world of imagination. Now, mind you, imagination is the opposite of illusion. Imagination is a thing of images, and we, after all, are made in the image of God. And my childhood was filled with images. One of my most vivid memories is of a toy theater, which my father built for me. I liked the toy theater, even though I knew that it was a toy theater. I liked the small figures, even when I found out that they were made of cardboard. I never felt tricked, you see. The white light of wonder shone on the whole thing. The figures of wood and of cardboard gave me glorious glimpses into the possibilities of existence. Perhaps my appreciation of the toy theater was in part an appreciation of the carpenter who built it, which ultimately helped me appreciate another carpenter.
That's certainly a beautiful image indeed. Your childhood sounds very happy.
At the same time, you must not imagine that I had a completely comfortable childhood, or that I passed it in complete contentment. You see, when I was a boy, I was often unhappy, like other children. I was very often naughty in childhood, like other children. And I never doubted for a moment the moral of all the moral tales, that as a general principle, people ought to be unhappy when they have been naughty.
Well, that is certainly one of the many lessons which, if we learned as a child, we should carry with us throughout our lives.
Yes, I wanted to mention how terribly important my childhood was to the rest of my life. I have had many wonderful experiences. I have traveled to interesting places and talked to interesting men. I have been in the major political quarrels of my country. I have talked to important statesmen. I have met most of the great poets and prose writers of my time. I have traveled in the track of some of the earthquakes in the ends of the earth. I have lived in houses burned down in the tragic wars of Ireland. I have walked through the ruins of Polish palaces left behind by the Red Armies. I have heard talk of the secret signals of the Ku Klux Klan on the borders of Texas. I have seen the fanatical Arabs come up from the desert to attack the Jews in Jerusalem. But none of those people were as real to me as the cardboard figures in that toy theater of my childhood, because I was subconsciously certain then, as I am consciously certain now, that there is a white and solid road, a beginning of the life of man, and man darkens it afterwards. He goes astray from it in self-deception. It is not the child, you see, but the grown man who lives a life of make-believe and pretending, and it is he who has his head in a cloud. I knew that morning light. I did not know that it could be lost. I knew even less if it could be recovered. And I did lose it, and I did recover it.
You say you lost that morning light. Was this dark period later in your youth?
Yes, what I may call my period of madness coincided with a period of drifting and doing nothing. I dabbled in a number of things. I dabbled in spiritualism, and I knew I was playing with fire then, even hellfire.
Well, please tell us more about that.
What surprises me in looking back on youth is how quickly a young man can think his way back to fundamental things, and even to the denial of fundamental things. I had thought my way back to thought itself. It is a very dreadful thing to do, for it may lead to thinking there is nothing but thought. I did not clearly distinguish between dreaming and waking. I felt as if everything might be a dream. It was as if I had myself projected the universe from within, with its trees and stars, as if I were their creator, as if I were God. These, of course, are the thoughts of a madman. Yet I was not mad in any medical or physical sense. I was simply carrying the skepticism of my time as far as it would go. I found it would go a great deal further than most of the skeptics went. While dull atheists came and explained to me that there was nothing but matter, I listened with a sort of calm horror of detachment, suspecting that there was nothing but mind. I have always felt that there was something third-rate about materialists and materialism ever since. The atheist had told me so pompously that he did not believe there was any God. And there were moments when I did not even believe there was any atheist.
But this radical way of thinking had to have effects on the other aspects of your life.
As with mental extremes, so with moral extremes. I could imagine the maddest crime when I had never committed even the mildest crime.
Do you think any of this had to do with the atmosphere of the times? I mean, after all, it was the time of Oscar Wilde and the decadence.
Well, with all due respect to Oscar Wilde, I cannot blame him for any of my own ideas. I manufactured most of my morbidities by myself.
As you basically said in your book, Orthodoxy, though, morbidities or morbid thoughts are by their very definition self-destructive.
Well, yes, that's precisely the point. I was going through a kind of spiritual suicide. I had never heard of confession in those days, but that is what I really needed. You see, I had dug quite low enough to discover the devil. I knew the reality of evil and the reality of sin. When I had been in these dark depths for some time, I suddenly had a strong inward impulse to revolt, to throw off this nightmare. But I had no help from philosophy or religion, because as I was still trying to think the thing out by myself, I invented a makeshift mystical theory of my own. And it was this, that even mere existence, reduced to its most primary limits, was extraordinary enough to be exciting. Anything was magnificent as compared with nothing.
But you said you had no philosophical or religious help. You must have had some intellectual or spiritual help from some quarter. What would you say were the good influences in your life? I know you were a great reader, for instance. Were there any writers who helped you find yourself out of this darkness, even though they were not religious writers per se?
Yes, Charles Dickens comes to mind with his endless hope, and Robert Louis Stevenson with his belief in the ultimate decency of things. The poet Robert Browning, who wrote, "God must be glad one loves his world so much." The poet Walt Whitman was a hospitable giant who delivered me from the decadent cynicism that swept away so many young men of my time. And there was another poet who attracted me, a poet whose whole life was a poem, St. Francis of Assisi. He was never a stranger to me. I was drawn to St. Francis very early, when I had no more idea of becoming a Catholic than becoming a cannibal.
It's interesting that many non-Catholics are drawn to you in a similar way as you were drawn to St. Francis. They have no intention of becoming Catholic, but you have a way of speaking to them. You are not a stranger to them. Through your writing, you became their friend. They end up thinking about the Catholic faith in an entirely new light, and in some cases, they even think about the Catholic faith for the first time. And one of the reasons there have been many converts in the last few years is that people have been learning about the Catholic faith for the first time. And these are not people who are ignorant about their own faith. On the contrary, many of them are fervent believers of great conviction, very enthusiastic about their Protestant faith.
When an enthusiast discovers through experience and sympathy that there is another half of the truth that he has not yet been told, then there is presented to him a perilous alternative. If he goes on to the whole truth, he will become more wise, but he will also become more ordinary.
More ordinary?
You see, ordinary means the acceptance of an order. The people who do not accept an order are left with chaos. Those are the only two choices, though modern people try to avoid making this choice. In most modern people there is a battle between the new opinions, which they do not follow out to their end, and the old traditions, which they do not trace back to their beginning. You see, if they followed the new notions forward, it would lead them to bedlam, to madness. If they followed the better instincts backward, it would lead them to Rome, to the Catholic Church. And so what they try to do instead is to remain suspended between two logical alternatives, trying to tell themselves that they are merely avoiding two extremes.
Very true. We mentioned the writers who influenced you and the fact that you, in turn, have been a writer of great influence for so many others. How did you begin your literary career?
I went to art school, of course, and failed entirely to learn how to paint or draw. But there I met a fellow student named Ernest Hodder Williams. He and I often talked about literature, and he conceived the strange notion that I could write, a delusion which he retained to the end of his death, I must say. He gave me some books on art to review for a magazine called The Bookman, which was published by his family. I tossed off some criticisms of the weaker points and misdirected talents of some great artists, and I found I had discovered the easiest of all professions in the process, which I have pursued ever since.
I am amazed that you wrote so many books. I can't imagine how you found the time. You wrote novels, literary criticisms, biographies, history books, philosophy books, and to mention poetry and plays. But is it true that you have always considered yourself primarily a journalist?
Of course, I am a journalist, and therefore I am vastly ignorant of many things. But you see, because I am a journalist, I write and talk about them all anyway. If you are writing an article, you can say anything that comes into your head. I would sooner call myself a journalist than an author, because a journalist is a journeyman.
The journalist is a journeyman. I guess that makes you a perfect guest for the journey home.
And the ultimate goal of any journey is to get home. But I have had a very jolly time as a journalist and never asked to be anything better. The definition of journalism, as I have said, and as I have good reason to know, is writing badly. I really am conscious of how badly and clumsily I use the English language, except when I am at the white heat of controversy. Then I at least get the illusion that I am doing things rather well. It's the best fun in life, this argument business, and what makes being a journalist really worthwhile.
Well, I wish I could use the English language as badly and clumsily as you do. But let's talk a little bit about this argument business. It was through arguing that you became a defender of the Catholic faith, but that was not something you set out to do. You were merely responding to the many modern attacks on the Christian faith.
I merely realized that the attacks on the Christian faith were attacks on common sense. I began defending common sense and ended by defending Christianity. I never realized the great common sense of the Christian creed until the anti-Christian writers pointed it out to me. I did not begin by defending this or that theological point. I was merely defending plain old human morals. I was defending responsibility, which is something called the question of free will. It was not that I began by believing in supernormal things. It was that the unbelievers began by disbelieving even in normal things. It was the secularists who drove me to theological ethics, by themselves destroying any sane or rational possibility of secular ethics. It was the scientific determinist who told me at the top of his voice that I could not be responsible at all. And you see, as I rather like being treated as a responsible being and not as a lunatic let out for the day, I began to look around for some spiritual asylum that was not merely a lunatic asylum. On that day, in short, I escaped from an error which still entangles many better men than myself. There is still a notion that the agnostic can be content with knowledge about worldly things and never settle the questions about the otherworldly things. But it is not true. The question of the skeptic strike direct at the heart of our human life. They disturb this world, quite apart from the other world. And it is exactly common sense that they distrust most. They could not be a better example than this determinist shouting to a mob of millions that no man ought to be blamed for anything he did, because it was all heredity and environment. Logically, that would stop a man in the act of saying thank you to somebody for passing him the mustard. For how could he be praised for passing the mustard if he could not be blamed for not passing the mustard?
Yes, that's very interesting. If there is no free will, it does not make any sense to say please or thank you. And pure materialism takes away any notion at all of free will. No wonder you found materialism to be third rate. But you debated the great agnostics of your time, people like George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells.
And they were men who became great personal friends, though we never agreed on anything.
But you also made some great friends with men with whom you agreed on most everything. I'm thinking of Hilaire Belloc and Father John O'Connor.
Belloc was a real literary man. He had the same motives I had for producing journalism, but he produced literature, much of it superb literature. He was a great friend, and a great defender of the faith, and a great defender of democracy, which he would sometimes defend violently. As for Father O'Connor, I met him when I gave a lecture in Yorkshire. He was a small man with an elfish expression. I was struck by the tact and humor with which he mingled with his very Protestant company. And I soon found out that they appreciated him, even though I suppose they really thought that he had his house fitted up with all the torture engines of the Spanish Inquisition. I liked him very much. But if you had told me that 10 years afterwards I should be a Mormon missionary in the Cannibal Islands, I should not have been more surprised than at the suggestion that fully 15 years afterwards I should be making to him my general confession and being received into the Roman Catholic Church.
And isn't it true that Father O'Connor was the priest who was the inspiration for your wonderful fictional detective, Father Brown?
Well, Father Brown's chief feature was to be featureless. The point of him was to appear pointless. You might even say that his most conspicuous quality was being inconspicuous. His commonplace exterior was meant to contrast with his unsuspected vigilance and intelligence. That being so, of course, I made his appearance shabby and shapeless, his face round and expressionless, his manners clumsy, and so on. My friend, Father John O'Connor, as a matter of fact, did not have any of these external qualities. He was not shabby, but rather neat. He was not clumsy, but very delicate and dexterous. He not only was amusing, but he always looked amused. He was a sensitive and quick-witted Irishman. My Father Brown was deliberately described as an English dumpling.
Well, so he wasn't the inspiration for Father Brown, then?
Oh, yes, of course he was. There is a very real sense in which Father O'Connor was the intellectual inspiration of these stories, and of much more important things as well. I never knew a man who could turn with more ease than he from one topic to another, or who had more unexpected stores of information, often purely technical information, upon all. But I was also surprised to find out what else he knew. He knew about evil. I told you earlier that in my own youth I had imagined for myself any amount of iniquity. It was a curious experience to find that this quiet and pleasant celibate had plumbed those abysses far deeper than I. After talking to him, I learned of horrors that I could not have imagined. He would have been a great modern novelist, but he told me these things reluctantly, in strictest privacy, as a practical necessity, you see, to prevent me from error.
So he was the inspiration for the Father Brown, and that's what I thought. But I remember hearing a story of how you saw two college students talking to Father O'Connor, and after he left, they appeared to be mildly impressed with his wide knowledge of things, but since he was a priest, they considered him naive, that he didn't know anything about the real evil in the world. But you knew from the rather appalling things that Father O'Connor had told you that it was in fact the college students who were naive, and the priest knew far more about real evil than they ever would.
Fortunately for them.
Is that how the character of Father Brown was born then? The priest that people did not take seriously. Everyone assumed he knew nothing about evil, but actually he had more insight into the crime because he had more insight into the soul.
Yes, but the incident of the Cambridge undergraduates and their breezy contempt for the cloistered virtues of a parish priest stood for much more serious things in my life than the heap of corpses that littered my detective stories. It brought me face to face once more with those morbid problems of the soul, the problems I alluded to earlier. Gave me a great and growing sense that I had not found any real spiritual solution to those problems. I had this sudden glimpse of the pit that is at all our feet. I was surprised at my own surprise. It was easy to believe that the Catholic Church knew more about good than I did, but that she knew more about evil than I did seemed incredible.
And so when people ask you, why did you join the Catholic Church? What do you say?
Well, the first essential answer, of course, is to get rid of my sins. For there is no other religious system that really does profess to get rid of people's sins. It is confirmed by the logic, which to many seems startling, by which the Church deduces that sin confessed and adequately repented is actually abolished, and that the sinner really does begin again as if he had never sinned. And this brings me back to what I said earlier about the innocence of childhood, that strange daylight, which was something more than the light of common day that still shines in my memory. Well, when a Catholic comes from confession, he truly does, by definition, step out again into that dawn of his own beginning and look with new eyes across the world. In that brief ritual, God has really remade him in his own image. He is now the new experiment of the Creator. He is as much a new experiment as he was when he was only 5 years old. He stands, as I said, in the white light at the worthy beginning of the life of a man. The accumulations of time can no longer terrify. He may be grey and gouty, but at that moment he is only 5 minutes old.
And as you said earlier, that when you went through that dark period in your youth, what you really needed was confession.
Yes, yes. The sacrament of penance and the equally staggering doctrine of the divine love for man. These doctrines seem to link up my whole life from the beginning, as no other doctrines could possibly do, and especially to settle simultaneously the two problems of my childish happiness and my boyish brooding. And they especially affected one idea, which I could call the chief idea of my life, the idea of taking things with gratitude and not taking things for granted. Thanks are the highest form of thought. We should be thankful for life, but we should even be more thankful for new life. The sacrament of penance gives new life. But the gift comes at a price and is conditioned by a confession. In other words, the name of the price is truth, which may also be called reality, but it is facing the reality about oneself.
You said to get rid of your sins was the primary or essential answer to the question of why you became Catholic. But what else opened your heart to the Catholic Church?
The difficulty of explaining why I am a Catholic is that there really are 10,000 reasons, but all amounting to one reason, that Catholicism is true. And the difficulty of treating the matter personally and describing my own conversion is that I fear this makes the whole business look much smaller than it really is. Numbers of much better men have sincerely converted to much worse religions. But what I can say about the Catholic Church cannot be said of any of its rivals, namely, that it is Catholic, that is, that it is universal. It is not only larger than me, but larger than anything in the world. It is indeed larger than the world.
It's obvious that we're just scratching the surface here, but we need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to take some calls and emails with questions for our distinguished guest, Mr. GK Chesterton. Welcome back. We're here with the great writer and convert GK Chesterton, and he has told us that one of the main things that led him to the Catholic Church was the sacrament of confession, the idea of getting rid of his sins. Also, in the philosophies that he was exposed to as a young man, he found that if they were taken to their logical conclusion, they led to madness and self-destruction. Those philosophies are all the modern ideas of relativism and materialism and scientific determinism and self-gratification that we're all well aware of. It was only when he considered traditional Christianity and the Catholic faith that he found a philosophy that led to sanity and to life. We should point out that much of this story is told in his book, Orthodoxy, which is about how he became a Christian, and also then in his book, The Catholic Church and Conversion, in which he discusses becoming Catholic. But right now, Mr. Chesterton has agreed to answer some questions. So here's an email. It's from Sean in Illinois, and he writes, "Dear Marcus and Mr. Chesterton, what advice would you give to a young person who wants to be a journalist?"
Well, the real advice I could give to a young journalist, now that I am myself an old journalist, is simply this. Write an article for the Sporting Times and another for the Church Times, and then put them into the wrong envelopes. What is really the matter with almost every paper is that it is much too full of things suitable to the paper.
Thank you, Mr. Chesterton. And we now have a caller. This is Peter in Reading, Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
I just wanted to tell you, Mr. Chesterton, that I am a great admirer of yours.
Well, it happens that most of my literary admirers live in asylums.
But I do have a question. It seems you have written about everything. Is there any book that you haven't written that you would like to write?
Well, someday, I think, I shall write a thrilling book of travels about all of the places I have never visited.
Thank you. Here's another email, and it looks like this one is from Dan in Arkansas. He writes, "Marcus, the question is for your guest. It makes sense that you came to the Catholic Church. You and the Catholic Church are made for each other. You're both stuck in backward thinking, in forgotten traditions and old ideas. The Catholic Church is always the enemy of new ideas."
Probably did not occur to him, Marcus, that his own remark was not exactly in the nature of a new idea. It is one of the notions that Catholics have to be continually refuting. Indeed, those who complain that Catholicism cannot say anything new seldom think it necessary to say anything new about Catholicism. As a matter of fact, when it comes to that, the ideas that really are new and worthwhile, Catholics have continually suffered through supporting them when they really were new, when they were much too new to find any other support. For instance, nearly 200 years before the Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution, in an age devoted to the pride and praise of princes, Cardinal Bellarmine laid down lucidly the whole theory of real democracy. There are passages in Pope Leo's encyclical on labor, Rerum Novarum, which are only now beginning to be used as hints for social movements much newer than socialism. And when Mr. Belloc wrote about the servile state, he advanced an economic theory so original that hardly anybody has yet realized what it is. A few centuries hence, other people will probably repeat it, and repeat it wrong. And then, if Catholics object, their protest will be easily explained by the well-known fact that Catholics never care for new ideas. Nevertheless, the man who made that remark about Catholics meant something. What he meant was that in the modern world, the Catholic Church is in fact the enemy of many influential fashions, most of which still claim to be new, though many of them are beginning to be a little stale. A new philosophy, in general, means nothing more than the praise of some old vice, insofar as he means that the Church often attacks what the world at any given moment supports. He's perfectly right. The Church does often set herself against the fashion of this world that passes away, and she has experience enough to know very rapidly it does pass away. The Catholic Church is the only thing that frees a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age.
That's worth repeating. The Catholic Church is the only thing that frees a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age. I think we have another caller. This is Debbie from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Welcome to the Journey Home.
Hello, Mr. Chesterton. What do you say to the fundamentalist, the Protestant who believes in sola scriptura, the idea that the Bible is the only basis of Christian truth?
The Catholic Church is more fundamental than fundamentalism. It knows where the Bible came from. It does not, in the conventional phrase, believe what the Bible says, for the simple reason that the Bible does not say anything. You cannot put a book in the witness box and ask it what it really means. The fundamentalist controversy itself destroys fundamentalism. The Bible by itself cannot be a basis of agreement when it is a cause of disagreement. It cannot be the common ground of Christians when some take it allegorically and some literally. Protestants appealed from priests to the Bible and did not realize that the Bible also could be questioned. There is no end to the dissolution of ideas, the destruction of all tests of truth that has become possible since men abandoned the attempt to keep a central and civilized truth, to contain all the truths and trace out and refute all errors. Since then, each group has taken one truth at a time and spent the time in turning it into a falsehood. But in all probability, all that is best in Protestantism will survive, but only in Catholicism.
Thank you, Mr. Chesterton. We have another caller. Please tell us your name and where you're from.
Hello, my name is Joe, and I'm calling from Hartford, Connecticut. Mr. Chesterton, I'm anxious to know if you have any comment on the recent scandal in the Catholic Church. I mean, don't you think that the heinous behavior of these priests and the hypocrisy of the hierarchy has exposed the Church as a huge fraud?
The sins of Christianity is one of the doctrines of Christianity. And the Church is not justified when her children do not sin, but when they do. The world really pays the supreme compliment to the Catholic Church in being intolerant of her tolerating even the appearance of the evils which it tolerates in everything else.
Yes, the world always holds the Catholic Church up to a standard that the world is certainly not willing to hold itself up to. It points to the very truth the Church claims. Here's another email. Dear Mr. Chesterton, you are an eloquent spokesman for your faith and at times make it sound almost irresistible, but it is not the faith for me. You can't change the fact that there are a lot of things in Catholicism that are quite vulgar. There are a lot of things that don't make any apparent sense, and quite frankly, there are a lot of things that I just have no use for. He didn't sign his name, and he didn't really ask a question, but would you care to comment, Mr. Chesterton?
He might just as well have said that there are a great many things in the Encyclopedia Britannica for which he has no use. Then it might occur to him that the work in question is meant for humanity and not just for him.
Very fine, Mr. Chesterton. We've got another caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Jerry from New York. Mr. Chesterton, I'm not sure how to ask this. The problem is that the old moral system is simply breaking down. I personally am opposed to things like abortion and homosexual marriage and all that, but abortion is already here and gay marriage is inevitable. At some point, don't we just have to give up on the old ways of doing things and accept the new things, like them or not?
Well, Jerry, I think the key word is inevitability, or as I should be inclined to call it, impenitence. We are subconsciously dominated in all departments by the notion that there is no turning back, and it is rooted in materialism and the denial of free will. Now, this modern refusal to undo what has been done is not only an intellectual fault, it is also a moral fault. It is not merely our mental inability to understand the mistake we have made. It is also our spiritual refusal to admit that we have made a mistake.
I think we have time for one more. Here's an email from Anne in Elgin, Illinois, and she writes, Dear Mr. Chesterton, could you deal with the issue of the Blessed Virgin Mary in your conversion, and what role does she play in your faith? God bless you, and thank you for your email.
I grew up in a Protestant world, but I was lucky that among my own family and friends, there was none of that strange mania against Mariolatry. There was none of that mad vigilance that watches for the first faint signs of the cult of Mary as for the spots of a plague. No one ever presumed that she was encroaching upon Christ. My family and friends knew nothing about the Catholic Church, but they did know something about this sacred figure, that she represented an idea that was noble and beautiful. In England, we called her the Madonna instead of Our Lady, an expression which reveals the English instinct for compromise, so as to avoid both reverence and irreverence. Mary and my conversion are the most personal of topics, because conversion is ultimately something personal. But also the devotion to Mary is a personal devotion. God is God, maker of all things visible and invisible. The Mother of God is in a rather special sense connected with things visible, since she is of this earth, and through her bodily being, God was revealed to the senses. In the presence of God, we are reminded of what is invisible, the intellect, reason, truth. But with Our Lady, we are reminded of the visible. God incarnate plays on her lap. She gathers up the elements of the heart and the higher instincts.
Let's think about that for a second. God is abstract to us, but Christ, as God in the flesh, is very concrete. And Mary is obviously directly connected to Jesus, to God in the flesh, and connected in a very special way. But Mr. Chesterton, when you say she represents the elements of the heart and the higher instincts, you're not saying that these instincts contradict reason.
Oh, no, not at all. But those elements of the heart cut through reason. They are the legitimate shortcuts to the love of God. They can only be experienced personally. At least that is how I experience them. I always had a curious longing for this particular tradition. I was always haunted by the idea. In fact, I can scarcely remember a time when the image of Our Lady did not stand up in my mind, quite definitely, the mention of anything Catholic. I was quite distant from these things, and then doubtful about these things, and then disputing with the world for them, and with myself against them. That is the condition before conversion. But whether the figure was distant, or was dark and mysterious, or was a scandal to my contemporaries, or was a challenge to myself, I never doubted that this figure was the figure of the faith. She was only human, but she was a complete human being, and she embodied everything that the Catholic faith had to say to the world. The instant I remembered the Catholic Church, I remembered her. When I tried to forget the Catholic Church, I was trying to forget her. When I finally faced the freest and the hardest of all my acts of freedom, that final decision that no one else could make for me, it was in front of a gilded and very gaudy little image of her in the port of Brindisi, and it was there that I promised that I would become a Catholic when I returned to England.
A promise that you made on your journey home.
Indeed.
Well, we're out of time, Mr. Chesterton. I want to thank you for being on the program, but most of all, on behalf of so many others, I want to thank you for using your great literary gifts to bring the truth of the Catholic faith to the modern world. One of the best things you have done is to demonstrate that the eternal truths are common sense. In fact, Dale Ahlquist has dubbed you the apostle of common sense. So thank you, Mr. Chesterton, for bringing us the good news of common sense.
I prefer to believe that common sense is something that my readers and I have in common. But thank you very much for your hospitality.
And thank all of you for joining me on this journey back in time to visit with this great defender of the Catholic faith. And as GK Chesterton himself said, life is a journey, and the purpose of every journey is to get home. So until next time, may the Lord bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen.